Sie haben Geburtstag? Ja, Jungs, dann bitte.
Happy birthday to you.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday to you.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday to you.
All right. Happy birthday.
It is Monday, September the 19th. September the 18th, 2023. You are tuned into the Joseph Benamy Show. I am your host, Joseph Benamy. Thank you so much for joining in. And okay, it's not really a birthday for the show. It's not a birthday for me. It's not a birthday for any of my close relatives, at least not that I know of. But I wanted to have a bit of a celebration today because it is our 100th episode, which in the big scheme of things is not a very large milestone. I get that. But all the same, it's a milestone anyway. Call it a small milestone. We'll call it a kilometer stone. How does that sound? It's a kilometer stone as opposed to a milestone. After all, here in Canada, we use kilometers. We are in the metric system here. It was a forced conversion away from the imperial system with feet and inches and pounds and miles and rods and fathoms and acres to the metric system. But we got through it. What a battle it was too in the early and mid 1970s when I was young and I was going to school. So when it comes to measurements, etc., I guess I have to say I am perfectly bilingual. I can handle both the metric system and I can handle the metric system and the imperial system. So I still think in terms of feet and inches and miles, but I also think in kilometers and meters and centimeters, millimeters, that kind of stuff. Grams, kilograms, not so much grams. But then, I have to tell you, when I'm cooking, okay, I know you're thinking to yourself, we don't tune into the Joseph Benamy Show to hear about cooking and grams, etc. And fair enough, okay? But this is kind of an eclectic show, so you never know what to expect. We're going to get to the controversial items and current affairs and all of that stuff soon enough, okay? So don't worry about it. But I just wanted to say that, when it comes to cooking, I come across cookbooks that talk about grams of sugar. Nobody does grams of sugar, really. You don't really weigh your sugar out. You take sugar in volume, not weight. And so, when I'm cooking or I'm baking, which I do a fair amount of, I won't say it's a full-fledged hobby of mine, but, I kind of enjoy it. I find it somewhat therapeutic. And so, I still use tablespoons and what else do I use? Tablespoons and I don't know how I did that. That was a bit of I know how I did it. Anyway, tablespoons and what else do I use? Teaspoons, cups, half a cup, quarter of a cup, third of a cup. Nobody does it really in grams. All right. Let's see. So, Monday, September the 18th, 2023. Well into the fall here now. Well, actually, not really. We have this season hasn't officially turned over yet. That doesn't happen until later in this week. But it's fall weather. It's cool. It's rainy. It's not as cool as it was so far in August. Well, no, let me correct that. It's about the same kind of weather we had all August here in Ottawa. So cool. August was much more rainy and much more humid, or much less rainy, I should say, and much more humid. It's one of those weird things, when the humidity gets to be 95% plus for some reason it's not raining. At least that seems to be my observation. So when it rains, the humidity actually goes down, even though it's wetter out. So August was really kind of strange because it was cool, but it was very humid. Nevertheless, it didn't rain. Today, it's raining and it's cool and it's much less humid. I kind of like it this way. I think I prefer it this way, to be honest with you. Anyway, lots of things in the news, lots of things for us to talk about tonight, my friends. So let's get right into it. The first thing is I want to just touch a base on. We're going to talk a little bit about the Freedom Convoy, and we're going to have to talk a little bit about the ongoing battle over so-called trans rights, trans children rights in schools. That has heated up somewhat again, or failed to cool down is probably a more accurate way to put it. But just to kick off the show tonight, something completely, at least insofar as I'm concerned, completely unexpected. And that is that the court, an Ontario Superior Court, dismissed today. We'd been waiting for this ruling. We'd been waiting for this ruling with some trepidation. There was a coalition of sex workers who were suing the government. They had brought a challenge, launched a constitutional challenge to the sex workers legislation, criminal code provisions, limiting the kind of activities that people in the sex trade can engage in while soliciting business. So, you can't stop traffic. You can't. Public solicitation is not legal, etc. Prostitution, interestingly enough, is not illegal in Canada. So, you don't actually, if you're a working girl or I guess a working guy these days, and you're engaging in sex for money, that's not strictly speaking illegal. There are aspects of it that may be illegal. Pimping is illegal. Solicitation is illegal. That kind of thing. But anyway, without getting into the details, some of you might challenge my exact interpretation of the law on that, but it's really not important. What is important is that there were certain changes to the criminal code that the previous Harper government, the conservative government of Stephen Harper, brought in, that precipitated a constitutional challenge by a coalition of sex workers. And everybody expected, I think, that the courts would find that these laws, criminal code provisions against sex workers, against prostitution, or certain aspects of the prostitution trade or industry were illegal. And so today, the court, and it's only a superior court, which is not like a Supreme Court. Superior Court is just actually a category of court in Ontario. It's not one of the hierarchy of courts. In other words, you can have provincial courts, superior court, etc., and it depends on what kind of law is being adjudicated. Really, I mean that's a very simplistic, very superficial way of looking at it, but some courts have certain jurisdiction over other courts, depending on what the law is and what the action is that's being brought. So the Superior Court, Ontario Superior Court, heard the case and ruled today that in fact the laws were constitutional. Now, we'll take a victory over the rapid deterioration of social mores, the rapid deterioration of the society's insistence on, at least insofar as the law is concerned, adhering to some traditional basic laws that, yes, I will say it, compel, coerce, if you will, decent behavior. I don't think that's such a bad thing. When you have a society, there are standards, public standards, and most public standards are not necessarily entrenched in law. They're really just traditions, etc. But society does have collectively some right, and I would even argue some responsibility to articulate standards and to establish a legal regimen whereby certain standards are become legal requirements, or violating these standards means breaking the law. And it's really important to understand what we're talking about here. Okay, remember, this is not a straight up what's the word I'm looking for, Puritan, a draconian piece of legislation. It was a carefully constructed uh, series of laws and regulations, etc., that aim to strike a balance between public standards, public decency, and people's right to do what they're doing in the event that they're not harming anyone. And I think that that's largely, not entirely, but that's largely, the position of these sex workers, is they're saying, well, how are we harming anyone? Why shouldn't we be allowed to practice this trade? There is some, my personal view is that's not a valid argument in a case like this, but I understand that there are people out there that are going to take the opposite view. So I get it. I'm not a Puritan myself, but I do believe in, as I say, some minimum standards and the right of society collectively using the government as its agent to establish those standards and enforce those standards. And that's what's happened here. Now, I told you already, I was shocked, surprised. I could not believe when I first read. I thought I must be misreading it. I had to read the headline 3 or 4 times before I was satisfied that, in fact, I understood it. Yes, indeed, the court, Ontario Superior Court, had indeed upheld the prostitution laws. We'll call them prostitution laws generally, and ruled that they were, in fact, constitutional. Now, there are some flies in that ointment, as they say, right? The first is that just because the court has ruled this doesn't mean that the Court of Appeal, because I fully expect that there's going to be an appeal of this, it doesn't mean that the Court of Appeal won't reverse the decision. And if in fact it does, I could see this going all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada. And again, my guess is that as it winds its way up and through the legal system, that probably we're going to end up with those laws being struck down. Now, I don't want to see them struck down. I sort of skimmed. I haven't read in detail the decision of the court as it was rendered today, but from what I was able to read, the reasoning, the logic in the argument was, in my view, impeccable. So I think it's a bit of an uphill climb for an appeal in this case, but it's not impossible that the case will be appealed. And if it is, it's not impossible that the Court of Appeal, A, will agree to hear the case, and B, will in fact reverse the decision. That will not be a surprise. I'm not predicting it, but it will not surprise me. All the same, let's take the victory where we can take it, and let's build on it, because this is, I think, a very reasonable thing. Look, you have to have some public standards, and we all agree with that. The question, if there's any disagreement out there, it's not whether or not there should be public standards, that there should be minimum standards of decency in the public. We all agree on that, okay? Where the disagreement is, where should that line be drawn? So let's not accuse people out there like me of being prudes because we think that the government should in fact have laws, anti-prostitution laws, and I would even have gone further on this, I think, in terms of drafting a law when the time came. But, I wasn't in a position to do anything about it at that time. I think that the government could go further in enforcing some degree of public decency. There are things that the courts have ruled are legal that I disagree with them. But wherever you draw the line, okay, don't call me a prude because I think there should be a line, because we all agree that there should be a line. Very few people think that there should be no standards. So that was worth noting. And it's a very funny thing, because as I was surfing around looking at the different news stories and my various news feeds here in Canada, not internationally, just domestically, I was surprised to see that this didn't get more play. So I don't know what that's all about, but there it is. So okay, let me just take a look here. Yeah, so that's the prostitution thing. As I say, nobody should think that the debate is over yet, or the legal challenges are over yet. I expect that it won't be very long before the coalition appeals the decision. So we'll have to see still what happens with that. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, it is time for us to go for our first break. So we'll be back in a couple of minutes here on the Joseph Ben-Ami Show. Please stay with us. We have much more to talk about.
Ice cream. Give me ice cream with whipped cream. Ice cream. Give me ice cream with whipped cream. Ice cream. A million flavors, let's just do it. Tie me up with ice cream. Sunny days need that cold hit. Ice cream. A million flavors, let's just do it. Tie me up with ice cream. Sunny days need that cold hit. That strawberry chocolate taste, ice cool vanilla for me. Hundreds and thousands, I need an ice cream island. Give me ice cream with whipped cream, strawberry sauce, and see my face gleam. I need a wafer on top, just ice cream full stop. So take me to the pudding shop. Ice cream, a million flavors, let's just do it. Tie me up with ice cream. Sunny days need that cold hit. Ice cream, a million flavors, let's just do it. Tie me up with ice cream. Sunny days need that cold hit. That strawberry chocolate taste.
There is just a feeling that this might be right for us, for you and me. There is just a look I think this might be right for us, for you and me. There is just a feeling that this might be right for us, for you and me. There is just a look I think this might.
And we are back. You are tuned into the Joseph Ben-Ami Show for Monday, September the 18th, 2023. I'm your host, Joseph Ben-Ami. Thank you so much for sticking with us. Okay, moving right along. Day 10 today of the Freedom Convoy trial here in Ottawa. More evidence, so-called evidence of mischief being brought forward by the Crown. Today we had the spectacle of a French-speaking, unilingual French-speaking police officer from Gatineau. Oh no, from the Sûreté. So it would have been the Quebec Provincial Police testifying that it was really hard to push back the protesters on the day that we came in, and we were pushing them back, and they were pushing back against us. He didn't really say it like that, but that was essentially what happened. And what was interesting about this is, remember, the two people that are on trial here in Ottawa in the Freedom Convoy trial are Tamara Lich and Chris Barber, both of whom are on trial for mischief, public mischief, and inciting others to commit mischief and intimidation. And the interesting thing that came out of today's testimony is that the police officer who was testifying was not able to testify that, in fact, the two accused defendants were, in fact, inciting the crowd to, quote unquote, hold the line at this time. And in fact, they couldn't have, because both Chris Barber and Tamara Lich at the time that this police officer was testifying, at the time that he was testifying about, when they were trying to clear the streets, Wellington Street, which is right here in Ottawa, it's right in front of the Parliament buildings. When the police were trying to clear that street of protesters, both Tamara Lich and Chris Barber had already been arrested and were in police custody. They were not on the scene. They were not participating in the protest. They were not inciting anyone to do anything. So you could argue, and I suppose that the Crown is going to argue in this case, that, well, they had done these YouTube videos, they had encouraged people, etc. So even though they weren't on site doing this today, or on this particular day at this particular time, the fact that the crowd was resisting the police was directly linked to the incitement or the encouragement that these individuals had already given, and in fact were still giving through recordings that were playing in Facebook and other social media. That's an interesting argument. I don't know whether it's a good, strong legal argument, but it's an interesting argument if you follow these kinds of things. But all of this just raises an important question. If that's the case that you're making, if you're making the case that these individuals had done social media postings, they had done videos, they had encouraged already people to resist the police, and I want to qualify that statement in a second, but I want to finish the point I'm making first. If you want to make that case, then make it. And in fact, I think the Crown attorneys in this have already made that case. They've already made that argument. Whether it's valid or not, or reasonable or not to take that position, that's beside the point. I'm just saying they've already made that argument. So why are they wasting the public's time, taxpayers' money, the court's time on bringing in this police officer to testify over something that he can't testify over? That is to say, the specific charges that have been brought against these two individuals. This police officer did not, in any way, shape, or form, add any kind of new information regarding the culpability of either Tamara Lich or Chris Barber in inciting the crowd to resist police orders. That's either already been established or it hasn't been established. And if it has been established, then the question is whether or not what they did was actually illegal. So, I did say, though, I want to qualify when I say the crowd resisting the police order to disperse and having to be physically pushed back, okay? I want to qualify that because it conjures up images that we're all used to seeing of, riots, picketers in violent union protests, etc., people throwing Molotov cocktails. I mean, we went through a period this year where we watched the demonstrations in Europe and France in particular, where cars were being burned, people were throwing projectiles at the police, whatever they could get their hands on, etc. And so when we talk about protesters, A, and B, protesters resisting the police order or not obeying the police, it conjures up these images, particularly when the crowd, the public who were not there, they were already primed, and they continue to be primed to regard the protesters from the Freedom Convoy as being somehow or other violent protesters. In fact, that was not the case. There was no violence here against the police. Okay, sure, the police might say you have to leave the street, you have to go home. Okay, the protest is over, go home, all finished. You might say, I'm not leaving. I'm standing my ground. You want me off the street, you have to pick me up physically and take me away. And maybe that means you have to arrest me for quote unquote committing some form of mischief, for not obeying a lawful police order. Okay? But violence? There was no violence here, ladies and gentlemen. There was, I want to stress this. It's not like there was very little violence. There was no violence. In the midst of these protests, particularly including when the police were moving in to break up the protests, there were groups of Christians, for instance, who were praying. They may not have been obeying police orders, but they certainly were not violent in their reaction to what the police did. Any violence that occurred during the breakup of this protest, any violence that occurred and was instigated by the police. Any physical contact, any kind of physical confrontation, any kind of physical pushing and shoving was 100% in every single case instigated by the police. And even then, the reaction of people who were resisting the police was not to punch, kick, throw projectiles, or any of that. The reaction of the protesters in this case was to simply not move. I'm not moving. I'm staying here. This is public property. I'm a tax-paying citizen of this country. I'm not moving off this sidewalk, and you can't make me. Of course, the police could make you. And in the circumstances, in the event, look, they have the legal authority to do it. The truth is that, the police have the legal authority under certain conditions to say to people, okay, break it up. That's it. Everybody go home. Break this crowd up. You have freedom of association. Now I'm going to get into trouble with some of my right-wing friends out there. Freedom of association is not 100%. Okay? Just because you have the right to freedom of association and just because it's entrenched in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms doesn't mean that you get to be a football hooligan. Okay? So there are limits. And the Constitution, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms here in Canada, clearly spells out that all of the rights that are enumerated in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms are your rights only up to and including the point where they are reasonable in a free and democratic society. I'm not saying that because I am supporting one argument or another. I'm not making any comment in this show at this point in time as to whether or not it's appropriate for us to have legal limits to the rights that are enumerated in the Constitution. I'm not making that argument. I'm merely pointing at the fact, often forgotten by those of us who are supporters of constitutional rights, that in this country, in Canada, the Constitution does not give you a blanket right to anything. Your fundamental charter rights are all subject to a court determining whether or not any abrogation of those rights, any violation of those rights is reasonable in a free and democratic society, which would include the circumstances in which those rights were trampled on. Now, I will reiterate, as I've said all along, the government did not have sufficient justification to invoke the Emergencies Act. There was no justification whatsoever, in my judgment, for the police to be ordered to move in and break the protest up. Yes, it was inconvenient. Yes, it was dragging on. But my experience with these things are people eventually, it dies out by itself. As I say, yes, it was inconvenient, but that's the nature of protesting. So, again, I don't get it. I don't get why they would have a police officer who was involved in breaking up the protest, in leading a contingent of police officers that were assisting the Ottawa police. I don't understand why the Crown would be wasting the court's time and, frankly, taxpayer resources on a day of testimony that doesn't offer any kind of new evidence that supports their argument that these two people are dangerous criminals. And let's not beat around the bush. Even if they're not suggesting, even if they're not explicitly saying that, the fact that we're even having this trial a year and a half later, and they set aside so much time, 16 days, and it's going to go longer than 16 days, my friends. We're already at day 10, and we're nowhere near getting this wrapped up. So, they're treating these two defendants as though they're dangerous criminals, even if they're not accusing them of being dangerous criminals explicitly. Okay, we have to go for a break, but before we go for a break, a related story to the Freedom Convoy trial, and that is in Alberta. Pastor Arthur Pawlowski was found guilty of mischief, which is what these guys in Ottawa are charged with. He was found guilty of mischief and breaching a release order for his role in the blockade at the Coutts border crossing in early 2022. That's the crossing, one of the crossings between Alberta and the United States. So there was a protest there, and they blockaded that particular crossing as well. And it was all related again to the Freedom Convoy. The Freedom Convoy didn't exist just in Ottawa. There were a number of protests in various locations across Canada. And at this particular one, Arthur Pawlowski was involved in resisting government orders and ultimately a court order that barred him from participating in these protests. And so he was found guilty. And, well, he was found guilty before, but he was sentenced today to 60 days in jail. 60 days in jail. I think that is a travesty, an absolute travesty. A man of the cloth who's essentially protesting the fact that churches, including his own, are being shut down and Christian worshipers are being prohibited from attending church services. And that got really ridiculous, my friends. It got so ridiculous that when churches were saying, okay, we're going to have a drive-in service where people are not going to do anything but sit in their cars in a parking lot connected to a low-frequency radio, which they do on a regular basis, okay, in large churches, and we're going to worship collectively but nobody's going to leave their cars. And still they had the police trying to block that from happening. Still, by law enforcement officers were still coming in and giving tickets, and arrests were made in certain circumstances, charges were laid, etc., etc., etc. For what? It was just mind-bogglingly stupid. And this is the kind of thing that Pastor Pawlowski was protesting against. And he was right to do that. At some point in time, when the government gets stupid, you have to say no. Yeah, we're not following what you're saying. That's what happens in a free and democratic society. So that was today. Pastor Pawlowski found out what his punishment was going to be. 60 days in jail. Absolute travesty of justice in my judgment, ladies and gentlemen. I don't know what else to say. All right, let's go for a break. We'll be back in a couple of minutes here on the Joseph Ben-Ami Show. Don't go away, more to come. And we are back. Thanks for sticking with us, ladies and gentlemen. You are tuned into the Joseph Ben-Ami Show for Monday, September the 18th, 2023. I am your host, Joseph Ben-Ami. All right, moving right along. What's the next controversial thing that we cannot let go of? This whole transgender thing in schools continues not just to be controversial, but continues to fuel controversy here in Canada. The federal government, not the federal government, pardon me, the Federal Conservative Party, which is poised to form a government in the next general election, if the polls that are out there are to be believed. So in any event, the government, I see I did it again. In any event, the Conservative Party took a position in its recently concluded policy conference that was held in Quebec City, recently took the position that it supported the argument that parents had the right to know if their children in school are asking to use different pronouns and if they want to use other bathrooms, etc. And, we have now 3 provinces in Canada that have taken official positions on this. Ontario has taken an official position on this, of course, supporting parental rights. Saskatchewan, and first in line was New Brunswick. The reason I wanted just to mention this again is because I'm encouraging people to not frame this entirely as a parental rights issue. I've said this before, but I think it's really important for me to take a minute to reiterate the argument that I'm making. And that is that this is not really about parental rights. When it comes to children and raising children, okay, yes, you can make the argument about parental rights, but really, I don't think that parents should ever frame their relationship with their children as a right instead of an obligation. I don't think parents have rights when it comes to children per se. I think that parents have obligations. And I think that it is grotesquely unjust for any government without sufficient reason for any government to step in and to block parents from fulfilling that fundamental obligation. Educating children is a parental obligation first and foremost. We may delegate that responsibility for the sake of time and efficiency and practicality. We may delegate our responsibility towards our children's education to people who are employed by the state. And remember, people who are employed by the state are our employees. So we may delegate that responsibility. But the fact that we delegate that responsibility in no way diminishes it. So I don't, ladies and gentlemen, I'm always uncomfortable. I'm always uncomfortable when I hear or when I read about parents talking about their rights. I don't think it's the correct way to frame this argument. There are rights involved, and as it happens, the rights that are involved are children's rights. But it's not the right of children to use a different pronoun that's being attacked here. It's the right of children to be parented by their parents. Every child has a fundamental and, in my view, inviolable right to be parented. And I think that, ladies and gentlemen, is the right that is being attacked here grotesquely. Remember, when children go through puberty, it is inherently difficult for them, confusing, emotionally turbulent, painful, physically and emotionally in many cases, distressing. It is part of the metamorphosis, if I could use that term, of human beings. The transition, the real transition that occurs for all human beings from childhood to adulthood. It's a long process. It's a challenging process. It's a painful process in many cases. It's a time when children, as they start to become adults, are full of questions about their identities. They will experiment. They will question themselves. They will be insecure. They may be, in many cases, especially with girls, embarrassed about the changes that are occurring in their bodies as they develop, as they mature physically? Nothing is more embarrassing for a guy than to go through a week or 2 weeks of his voice changing. These are very difficult times. There is no surprise to any parent who is worth, I was going to say they're worth their weight in gold. It's probably not the right phrase to use. Any parent who understands their children will tell you this is normal. And none of us would be surprised or are surprised. I know I'm not surprised when I hear about kids questioning their sexual identity, because they are completely open to these questions. It's perfectly, completely, 100% natural. What has changed today is that there is a movement that is teaching children, telling kids that the natural process that they're undergoing, the feelings of confusion, of distress that they are experiencing, are being caused by their not being allowed to be their true sexual selves. That's essentially what they're being told. That's new. But what leads children to feel these questions, to have them, to be confused, is that's perfectly natural. Every human being goes through it. And all you have to do is ask yourself this: why has this all of a sudden become an explosive epidemic? Suddenly, thousands and thousands of children have all of a sudden discovered that they are, they're not really the gender that they were born with. It's so. Anyway, look, I'm trying to find the right words. I sometimes I'm at a loss as to have the right words to describe what I'm thinking about this. Okay, it's just so idiotic what some parents are putting their kids through, what society is putting the kids through, what these people who are now saying that we, the schools, are justified in denying the fundamental right of these children to be parented, guided, supported during a difficult time by their parents. And parents know, they're wise enough to know. So this is it. I wanted again to go over this because it's so important, I think, that we really recognize what's under attack here. I understand when people want to frame it as a parental rights issue, but I think that misses the point entirely. It's not a parental rights issue as much as it is a child's rights issue. And the children in this case are being denied the right to be parented by their parents. And that is a fundamental human right for children. Every child has a parent, and every child has the right to be parented. And parents have an obligation to fulfill that role for their children. Now, there may be exceptional cases where, children do get abused by their parents, emotionally, physically. So there may be exceptions to that rule, but the fact that there are exceptions to the rule doesn't change the rule. That's why they are called exceptions. Okay. Oh, dear. We should extend the show to 2 hours from now on, because we could spend 2 hours just continuing to argue so many of these points. But we're not going to do that. We're going to have to go for our final break. But before we do that, ladies and gentlemen, I can't help but take a moment to just quickly address what I see here again as government coming up with crazy ideas about how they're going to fix problems that are nonsensical, not effective, but people just are so gullible they just swallow it hook, line, and sinker. Federal government, as you know, has suggested that they are going to end the GST, stop charging GST, removing GST on new apartment construction. Everybody is praising them for this, and I'm saying, well, hang on a second. GST is revenue neutral to developers. There's no saving here for them. There's no eliminating the GST does not create an incentive for these guys to engage in new rental construction. I'm astonished that people are actually thinking that this is a great thing. You do not pay if you're a contractor, you pay GST, but you collect GST. The GST that you pay is offset by the GST that you collect. It's really more or less a value-added tax. It's completely revenue neutral to the developers. So how this is supposed to spur new construction is it's beyond me. And I'm just flabbergasted that people are out there praising the new Liberal initiative in order to address the housing crisis. And then to add insult to injury, what do I read today? What do we discover today? That our Conservative Party leader, that the Conservative government in Ontario has agreed to provide the City of Toronto with $26.4 million to help house asylum seekers. Well, why is the provincial government doing this? Now, I understand there's only one taxpayer, so in the end, it doesn't really matter whether it's the federal government, provincial government, or municipal governments that are taxing citizens in order to raise the revenue to house asylum seekers. But asylum seekers is 100% the responsibility of the federal government. So why is the Ontario government financing this? I don't get it. Does nobody care about constitutional division of powers anymore? And if now what we're doing is, instead of holding the federal government responsible for its grotesque, gross mismanagement of its finances and its responsibilities, instead of holding the federal government, our provincial government, our Conservative provincial government, is bailing out the federal government. Unbelievable. Right. Where are the conservatives, the real conservatives in this country? That's what I want to know. I want to know, where are the real conservatives in this country? I just don't know. I don't see them. And with all due respect, my friends, don't tell me about Maxime Bernier and the People's Party. When the People's Party gets its act together as a political party that is serious about potentially electing members of parliament, which there are ways to go about doing this organizationally, building your organization. When they get serious about doing that methodically, carefully, systematically, then there's an argument to be made. It doesn't matter to me that Maxime Bernier is going out there giving speech. I could agree with most of what he talks about. And even if I agreed with 100% of what he was doing and talking about, that doesn't translate into impacting and affecting government policy. Okay, third and final break for the evening. I must get away from the microphone for a few minutes here because I think I need to take a dose of Valium. So I'm going to go and see what I can find in pharmaceuticals, while the rest of you, well, maybe you have to go and find some pharmaceutical for yourselves as well. I just don't know. In the meantime, ladies and gentlemen, stay tuned. We are going to be back in a couple of minutes here on the Joseph Ben-Ami Show. And welcome back. You are tuned into the Joseph Ben-Ami Show for Monday, September the 18th, 2023. I'm your host, Joseph Ben-Ami. Thank you so much for staying with us. We are into the home stretch for this evening's show, which means, as you all know, it's time for this day in history. And I hadn't planned on this, but I was before the break. I was joking around about I'm going to have to go and find some Valium or some other pharmaceutical aid to my keeping my blood pressure down, calming me down, getting rid of the anxiety, getting rid of the tension, the frustration, etc. And I was making a joke about, well, maybe you have to do the same thing. As it happens, today, in 1970, American rock guitarist and singer Jimi Hendrix died of an overdose of barbiturates in London, England. So that happened today in 1970. What else happened today in the year 2014? We're not going to go too far back in history here because it was a quiet day historically. But in 2014, Scottish voters rejected the idea of becoming a fully independent country for the first time since the late 1700s. So, citizens of Scotland, residents of Scotland, today in 2014 rejected the notion of becoming an independent country and voted no in a referendum. Also on this day in 2020, not that long ago, American lawyer and Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, only the second woman, to serve on the U.S. Supreme Court. She served from 1993 to 2020. She died at the age of 87 this day in 2020. Okay, what do we want to do now? I think what we want to do now is we want to mention to you that you should check out our website, www.josephbenamy, all one word without the hyphen, where you can watch this show when it's live, or you can catch the podcast of previous shows right there on the website. And it's a brand new website. You should check it out. It looks actually pretty darn cool, if I do say so myself. We're going to be adding a few more things to it. But in the meantime, check it out and bookmark it. And don't forget to send me an email. Let me know what you think about the show. Any suggestions, topics, etc. I do read my emails. And, ladies and gentlemen, here is another interesting development. If you are watching the show live, or if you're watching it, I guess it could be a recording later on, you see a QR code. Check it out, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, it is our new mobile app. That's right. You can get our podcast. All you got to do is download and install the app on your smartphone, and you can catch the Joseph Benamy Show right there with your headphones, your earbuds, on the bus, in the taxi, while you're walking, biking, jogging, rowing. What else would you do? Not swimming. I don't recommend you bring your smartphone into the pool with you. That would be a bad idea. Okay, I am going to let you go. 100th show tonight. This is the 100th show. It's been a great pleasure chatting with you. We will catch you again tomorrow night here on the Joseph Benamy Show. In the meantime, God bless. And remember, do not, whatever happens, ladies and gentlemen, drink the Kool-Aid.